one to another. But he didn't have the kind of understanding we look about, Darwinian, with just purely natural selection and environmental pressures and so on. They were looking at something internal because they believed in a consciousness. Plato believed that God created the world, but it was the same, but the universe was also co-eternal, which is quite difficult to hold those two things together, but that's what he did. But he had a very much this Hindu Brahmin concept, which followed through later on. Other scholars, when they looked at Plato, they realized that the influences again have come from a Hindu Vedantic school. And Sir William Jones, again, this is a quotation of him writing to a letter to Lord Monboddo from the Enlightenment here in Edinburgh. And he wrote, "I have seen enough of it to be convinced that the doctrines of the Vedanta school are Platonic." Another chap, Professor Urwick from the University of London, said, "I affirm very confidently that if anyone will make himself familiar with the old Indian wisdom, religion of the Vedas and the Upanishads, he will shake himself free from the academic attitude and limiting Western conception of philosophy, and will then read Plato's dialogues. He will hardly fail to realize that both are occupied with the self-same search, inspired by the same faith, drawn upwards by the same vision." Let's move on to Aristotle. He was a disciple of Plato. And many of his ideas, Plato, I think, thought he'd be a carbon copy and carry all his ideas through, which he didn't necessarily, because Aristotle thought for himself. He gained a number of his own ideas, but also a lot of his writings were taken straight from the thinking of Pythagoras and the writings of Pythagoreans before him. Now, a chap called Professor Arthur Lovejoy gave a series of lectures at the Harvard University, one of the leading universities in America, in the 1930s, and he wrote this book, The Great Chain of Being, a study of the history of an idea. And what he did, and it was really nice to find this book, is he did my work tracing through Aristotle right through to Charles Darwin. And as I said, gave that series at Harvard. Let's look at Aristotle. Unfortunately, the first quotation, I was digging around, I didn't put it in there. But here's a quotation from Aristotle's writings. "Nature gradually, step by step, developed from inanimate substances to living creatures. And again, other bloodless animals generate indeed, but from decaying earth and excrements." That's the same kind of concept that we had with the Hindus beforehand about spontaneous generation, living things coming out of non-living things in a progressive upward thing. And it was what was called the scala naturae, the ladder of nature, from the lowest forms to the highest forms up to humans. I won't read through that one, it's just a quotation of Encyclopedia of Philosophy, just confirming what I just said. Well, let's have a look at the rise of the naturalistic evolutionists. Now, what happened? A chap called Thales, we don't know very much about him, but he believed that everything could come about by itself through natural processes. And he was contemporary with Pythagoras. Remember I mentioned, for those who just joined us, Pythagoras came via Hindu understanding, and he was a pantheist, that he believed that God was the eternal universe. Now, Thales broke away from that route, and he decided everything came by itself. And then we have a number of other people that came through this line. Anaximander, who said that animals come into being from moisture evaporated by the sun. Humans originally resembled another type of animal, namely fish. Now, you're beginning to get a few things you can recognize here concerning evolution. Empedocles, he was a chap that Aristotle quoted. And Aristotle says, Empedocles says that the greater part of the members of the animals were generated by chance. In other words, he went that it was not some consciousness, it was a chance, randomness process that was going on. And then he said that many races must have been unable to beget and continue their kind, for in the case of every species that exists, either craft or courage or speed has from the beginning of its existence protected and preserved it. And like the Pythagoras, he believed in reincarnation. So even though he was very much a naturalistic philosopher, he held on to that Hindu, Pythagoras, Plato kind of understanding. Democritus, I'm not going to give you any quotes, otherwise we'll be here all night. But he was generally regarded as the father of the atomic theory. And he said, basically, that atoms appeared all by themselves, and through the process of randomness, the universe came into being as the atoms built up, and through eventually to life forms and so on. He also spoke about the evolution of language. And he said that human beings, first of all, they grunted like animals, and they went from that to a state of language through that long process. Epicurus, you may probably come across. Again, he talked about everything coming through a random process, natural process, through atoms. Natural selection he spoke about. They didn't use the phrase natural selection, but you read their writing, that's exactly what they're talking about. And Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman later on, a bit of a fan of Epicurus, he said, chance takes the place of God. Well, we move into the time of the early church, and now into the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And there was a famous school of Alexandria, led by a man called Ammonius, who had a great influence at that time. And he's very well known because at that time there were great big squabbles between the followers of Aristotle and the followers of Plato. And one lot were saying, oh, well, it's more by observation. The others were saying it's more metaphysical. And they were arguing back and forth. And he solved the division of these followers by saying, actually, they both had their foundation from Pythagoras, as we've already discovered tonight. There were two figures in the church, Clement of Alexandria on the left-hand side, and Origen, his disciple, on the right-hand side. And even though they were Christians, what they did is they brought in an allegorical method of interpreting the Bible. And they brought with them some of the ideas of Plato and so on, that became essentially the door that opened up the way for liberal thinking within the church. Later on, getting to the 1200s, Thomas Aquinas was a well-known monk from that period, wrestling as they were with a sort of a kind of revival of Aristotle and Plato's thinking, and he was trying to work it out and with his understanding of Scripture. We get into, I'm whizzing through these people quite quickly because it would take too long. You get to Leibniz, the German Plato, as he was called. And he was called German Plato, obviously, because he based a lot of his thinking on Platonic philosophy. To John Locke, an English philosopher, famous philosopher. And these kind of ideas about Aristotle and Plato and the forerunner of evolution were being discussed in this period. Now, we get to an interesting part, and Sir Francis Bacon, founding of the Royal Society and modern Freemasonry. You think, what on earth's that got to do with evolution that we've been talking about, and these ideas which go right through from the early times? Well, Francis Bacon was regarded as being founder of modern Freemasonry, particularly the Scottish Rite, and also being very much in founding the Royal Society in London in 1660, along with Robert Boyle and Sir Robert Murray. By the way, Murray House in part of Edinburgh University Education Centre is named after him. And you have to bear in mind, Christianity after the Reformation and so on was very strong. And any ideas which were contrary to that, philosophies tended to go underground. In other words, your Aristotle, your Plato, Pythagoras, going back to the Egyptians, Babylonians, all that kind of stuff. So some people kept a veneer of Christianity on the outside, but within, a hard core was still the philosophy was kept alive. The ancient philosophy was kept alive. You see this, for example, even in Edinburgh. If you go to George Street, you'll see the Grand Lodge of the Freemasons. And on the outside, you have a sculpture of Christ carrying a cross. So you think, oh, it's a Christian thing. But actually, when you go into Freemasonry, you discover it's not actually a Christian thing. Everything is interpreted through a very ancient philosophical system. So, bear in mind, too, that the Royal Society, wonderful as it is, because a lot of empirical science, and that's fantastic and great, was also very much founded by a bunch of people who are very much forerunners in Freemasonry. Now, here's a quotation straight from a lecture of an initiation of a 32nd degree Freemason. You don't tend to get this kind of information very often, but here it is for you tonight. It's supposed to be kept secret. But here we go. In the Scottish Rite, you will be taught that our ancient ancestors who knew all the mysteries left enough traces so that today we, with diligent labour and teaching, like we're trying to do tonight, may renew them and bring them to light for your enlightenment. We now come to the great symbol of Pythagoras. Our symbols have descended to us from the Aryans, which is like the Hindu Brahmins, and many were invented by Pythagoras, who studied in Egypt and Babylon. That we've already discussed those things. So they already knew this. And this philosophy, this understanding, was kept and preserved within Freemasonry in what's called speculative Freemasonry. And within Freemasonry, you have this understanding of a sort of an evolution up the ladders to a higher degree and a higher degree. On the left-hand side, you have what's called the Scottish Rite, 33 degrees, and on the right-hand side, the York Rite. And they debate about their ancestry and so on, but we won't get into that. Now, let's look at French Freemasonry and the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And if you look at those pictures, the one on the right is from the first edition of Encyclopedia, French Encyclopedia. And on the left-hand side, you probably can't make out very well, but you've got here, these are Ionic columns. And here's where the light comes, the Enlightenment comes. And these are all women down here. And this woman here, who's kind of veiled, represents truth. And at her feet are philosophy down here, and theology is somewhere down here. Somewhere along there anyway. And there's a whole bunch of these different ideas and so on, and science and everything else. But the light is coming from the Ionic philosophers. Who were the Ionic philosophers? Were those Greek philosophers I was mentioning earlier, those ones I was going through. So the French Academy of Science came via that line, and most of the people that were there on the board, the committee for the French Encyclopedia, were Freemasons. So in other words, you have this philosophy that comes right through the founding of that. Voltaire, of course, was a very famous person in the French Enlightenment, had an influence on David Hume here in Edinburgh. And he said, when I first read Plato and came upon the gradation of beings which rise from the lightest atom to the supreme being, I was struck with admiration. So in other words, and he, of course, was a Freemason too, and he, again, was referring to this Plato and this understanding, that quotation I had very early on, about from one form evolving through to another form. This philosophy was there within them. Now we come to home ground. And James Burnet, or Lord Monboddo, who was a High Court judge, quite an eccentric character, he used to take air baths, which in case you don't know what they are, he used to run around like real men with nothing on, he thought, and there's in his garden, in his home, and he'd take ice baths, which in the winter, and it was even colder in those days, Edinburgh, and so he'd have a bath in his garden, break the ice open and have an ice bath, because he thought it was, being like the Spartans, really tough. Now, there's a poem by a chap called Lord Neves, who again was a High Court judge in Edinburgh. Though Darwin now proclaims a law and spreads it far abroad, the man that first the secret saw was honest old Monboddo. The architect precedence takes of him who bears the hoddo, so up and at 'em, land of cakes will vindicate Monboddo. That land of cakes, by the way, is Scotland, saying, it's not Charles Darwin, he may have studied medicine here at Edinburgh University, but give the credit to Lord Monboddo. He's a man from Edinburgh, a true Scots. So let's have a look at this character, Lord Monboddo. Now here's an interesting photograph, a painting rather, of the Canongate Lodge, which is a Freemason lodge down the bottom of the Royal Mile. It's the oldest Masonic lodge building in the world. And here we have Robert Burns, who became the national poet. He was a 32nd degree Freemason, very high up, and real notables and intellectuals and the powerhouse behind the Enlightenment, because most of the Enlightenment was spread through the Masonic lodges, both in France and Germany and here in Britain and in Edinburgh. Now, down here, that's Lord Monboddo, James Burnet, looking on what's going on. And so, there we have him. Now, who